Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. Today I want to talk about gender neutral pronouns. As this topic is so broad, I've broken it up into separate chapters, of which will be shown in the video progress bar, and if not, the timestamps will be in the description. Before we get into it, I'd just like to ask you to subscribe. I know asking at the start of the video is a little weird and you can leave it to the end if you want, but either way it means a lot. Although it may not seem like it, I genuinely do put a lot of time and effort into these videos, and any kind of support really does mean a lot to me. Anyway, without further ado, let's get into it. But before I get into the juicy stuff, I just want to quickly clear up any possible confusion regarding the difference between sex and gender. If you already understand this concept, then you can sit back and relax for this segment. The difference between your gender identity and your biological sex is that one of them, gender, is a form of self-identification. This usually correlates to things such as clothing choice, your preferred name, preferred pronouns, and general masculinity or femininity. I'm sorry, I can't manage to say those two words. Of course, it isn't always the case that your gender identity will match up with your gender expression. So a good way to describe gender is an almost meaningless label that has no value to society. This is also where the idea of gender abolition comes from, but that's a topic for another time. In short, gender doesn't really refer to anything in practice. If gender always matched with masculinity or femininity or biological sex, then femboys, tomboys, and trans people wouldn't exist. And before someone comments a quick gotcha, no, you can't identify as an attack helicopter. Gender is a concept, something that refers to abstract ideas and forms of identification. You cannot identify as a real material object, as that breaks the definition of gender and also the separation between sex and gender.
I sexually identify as an attack helicopter. Ever since I was a boy, I dreamed of soaring over the oil fields, dropping hot sticky loads on disgusting foreigners.
Just saying, I sexually identify as an Apache attack helicopter is not the hilarious own you think it is. Anyway, moving on to your biological sex. Your sex is determined by a host of things, including but not limited to chromosomes, androgynous hormones, genitals, gamete production, and secondary sex characteristics. Meaning, for example, widened hips on females and an Adam's apple on males. But just because there's a difference between sex and gender doesn't mean they aren't linked. Female as a term socially is heavily associated with a woman, and the same for male and man. It isn't an epic omen to call a trans person by their biological sex just because you're being scientific. You're not being scientific. As Lorna Box said, all geniuses may be assholes, but not all assholes are geniuses. It genuinely amazes me how these people think they're some Rick Sanchez-esque character that knows everything about the universe. They have no feelings, no empathy for anyone, they're so cool and stone cold. No, you're just an asshole. Just to wrap this segment up, in short, gender is based in social roles, whereas your sex is based on your material being. This point is, again, for those of you watching who aren't as well as acquainted with trans and more specifically non-binary people's dysphoria. Anyway, let's just begin. As described by the United Kingdom's National Health Service, gender dysphoria is a term that describes a sense of unease that a person may have because of a mismatch between their biological sex and their gender identity. This sense of unease or dissatisfaction may be so intense it can lead to depression and anxiety and have a harmful impact on daily life. Gender dysphoria can come in many different forms and can affect you in different ways. Some trans people don't get dysphoria from their genitals and so don't see a reason to have bottom surgery, or as it's more commonly known, gender confirmation surgery / sex reassignment surgery. There's also dysphoria that's caused by social situations. Social dysphoria. Social dysphoria mainly comes from being misgendered or dead-named. Misgendering being when someone calls you by pronouns other than your preferred ones, or when someone mistakes you for your assigned gender at birth, whether on purpose or otherwise. And dead naming is when someone calls you your birth name rather than your preferred and chosen name. These both cause great distress for a trans person, which is why it'd be a great social good for them to be classed as hate crimes, when done on purpose of course. Calling someone the wrong pronouns or dead naming them continuously on purpose is just harassment, and it should be legally considered such. It causes a great deal of needless distress for innocent people, and if you engage in it, you deserve some form of punishment. Out of a sample of 3,458 trans people, 42.3% reported a suicide attempt and 26.3% reported misusing drugs or alcohol to cope with trans-related discrimination. After controlling for age, race, sex assigned at birth, binary gender identity, income, education, and employment status, family rejection was associated with increased odds of both behaviors. Odds increased significantly with increasing levels of family rejection. So there is substantial proof that misgendering trans people makes them feel worse, and correctly gendering them makes them feel better and more accepted. I mean, I'm not sure why I needed to use a study for that. It seems like a very simple concept. Anyway, before leaving off this topic, I want to also momentarily talk about gender euphoria. Gender euphoria is a sensation that, for example, a trans woman may get from presenting as a woman, i.e. wearing makeup, skirts, dresses, having long hair, painted nails, etc. Not every trans person experiences gender dysphoria, and some only feel gender euphoria. They go from feeling okay in their current body to then transitioning and feeling even better. I know I just made every trans medicalist click off this video, but I'm okay with that. You should also always use the correct pronouns of a trans person without gender dysphoria, because even then you're making them feel happy. And at the end of the day, isn't that what we want for everyone? Despite passing away in 1616, Shakespeare remains the most read fiction author of all time. I'm sure some folk watching this video have had to read Shakespeare at some point in their education. Romeo and Juliet, first played in 1597, remains one of the most well-known plays in the entire world.
If I profane with my unworthiest hand this holy shrine, the gentle sin is this: my lips, two blushing pilgrims ready stand to smooth that rough touch with a tender kiss.
Good pilgrim, you do wrong your hands too much, which mannerly devotion shows in this. For saints have hands that pilgrims' hands do touch, and palm to palm is holy palmer's kiss.
Have not saints lips and holy palmers too?
Aye, pilgrim lips that they must use in prayer.
My point is, everyone knows who Shakespeare was, and so I feel comfortable using his writing as an authority on this subject. There's not a man I meet but doth salute me. It's if I were their well-acquainted friend. Did you catch that? This is a quote from Act 4, Scene 3 of Shakespeare's 1594 play Comedy of Errors, in which, despite knowing the gender of the individual, there's not a man I meet, he still refers to the man with their. And every one to rest themselves betake, save thieves and cares and troubled minds that wake. Yet again, here Shakespeare uses the pronoun themselves, and every one to rest themselves, despite a singular antecedent. The argument I'm trying to tackle here is that of singular they being some new thing people have just invented, despite the fact that we can clearly see the most prolific writer of all time using singular they. Not only that, but singular they has been used and accepted for longer than singular you. Singular you only started to become accepted in the 17th century, whereas Shakespeare was using singular they, as we just mentioned, in the 16th century. This is further highlighted by Thomas Ellwood's rant in the 17th century, which goes as follows. Again, the corrupt and unsound form of speaking in the plural number to a single person, you to one, instead of thou, contrary to the pure, plain, and single language of truth, thou to one and you to more than one, which had always been used by God to men and men to God, as well as one to another, from the oldest record of time to corrupt men for corrupt ends in later and corrupt times, to flatter, fawn, and work upon the corrupt nature in men, brought in that false and senseless way of speaking you to one, which has since corrupted the modern languages, and hath greatly debased the spirits and depraved the manners of men. This evil custom I'd been as forward in as others, and this I was now called out of and required to cease from. God, I'm sorry for the weird breathing patterns, the grammar in that was just horrible, which is understandable since he probably wrote this while crying like a little baby. You could say he was a bit triggered. You may notice that the rather childish arguments being used in this infantile rant are extremely similar to the ones in the modern day against singular they. Before the 17th to 18th century, you were strictly plural, but as always, language changes as society progresses. They then being treated as a singular pronoun, along with referring to a group, hurts no one and helps many. Language was just made up in the first place to make communication easier, so why can't we reform it as we've been doing for millennia to make things easier? If Mao can reinvent the fucking alphabet to make reading simpler, I'm sure we can manage they-them. Just briefly before moving on, for those of you who don't know how singular they is used, and to just show how easy it actually is, let me give you an example that I definitely didn't just rip from someone else. The person went to their house, and they realized they'd forgotten their wallet at their friend's apartment. There is the possessive replacement for him/her him/her. They is the replacement for he/she, and although not used in this example, them is used as the replacement for him/her. See, it isn't so hard, is it? It really is just as simple as changing a few words. I mean, it's the same way you use plural they. I don't understand the confusion sometimes, if it's even there at all. We didn't just dig a hole in a forest and find language. We created it, we can change it as we've been doing for the past thousands of years. I shouldn't have to explain why or how non-binary people exist, since we already covered that by separating sex and gender. So we're just going to move straight on to neo-pronouns. Just a disclaimer, I won't be getting into xenogenders here, as that's a whole nother can of worms I'd rather not open. Neo-pronouns are a relatively new kind of subtype of pronouns. Some examples are ziza, jijem, and fei-fer. Sorry if I butchered that, I can't pronounce my ex as well. The arguments against these pronouns and pronouns alike are very similar to the ones against singular they. However, it's a little more targeted and unique in some aspects. So let's get into it. It's too confusing is something I hear a lot, but I'd like to draw a comparison between pronouns and names here. Pronouns are nothing but a way to refer to someone so the reader or listener knows who you're talking about. And while pronouns are usually less unique, they have an almost identical use to names. Now, with neo-pronouns, they generally are a lot more unique in most circles. And so when asking about someone's pronouns, why don't you also ask how and where to use them, and how they're pronounced? This is how we've done it with names for, again, millennia. I know I'm dissecting arguments that people don't sincerely make, since when you get to the root of why someone is against neo-pronouns, it's usually just, ooh, they're weird, that's not English. Which is not a very formidable argument. But I think it's still important to offer counters to these childlike takes. I don't see why people can't just ask someone's pronouns the same way they ask their name. I really don't. It's such a simple solution to accidental misgendering or assuming someone's gender and running with that. I also don't understand why people have to ignore someone's pronouns just because it's censorship to use them. Or, as I said in the beginning, you're just following the science. It's a really silly and childish mentality to think, just don't get triggered, lol XD, you're mad, that's your own problem. It isn't cool, it just makes you a half-witted schmuck. Yeah, I'm busting out the Eton insults for this one. And with that being said, I want to show this Blair White clip briefly before ending off the video, which I find to be a perfect example of this phenomenon.
My second thought is that this is highly narcissistic behavior. And no one ever really brings up narcissism when it comes to people who want people to call them doll and doll self and use these crazy pronouns that really just don't align with how human beings speak about other human beings. Like, there is so much narcissism that goes into that. If you expect everyone around you to alter the language in which they use for human beings, not even just for genders, because I remember when I first came out as transgender and my parents and my family and stuff, like they had, it was a process to come around to using she all the time. Now they do, obviously, but in the beginning it takes some time to go from he to she. But to go from like normal human interactions and human language to be like, hey tree self, hey girl, that's ill. It's very much serving the same energy as like, pick out the red and yellow M&Ms for me, darling. Like, it's very that.
Yeah, so apparently it's narcissistic to want people to treat you with basic human decency, I guess. And certain pronouns, for some arbitrary reason, don't align with how human beings speak about other human beings, which just doesn't make any sense. She just said nothing here. People have feelings, it's a fundamental part of what makes us human, our innate empathy. It doesn't make you some genius Rick Sanchez-like character to ignore people's feelings and mental health. It just makes you a prick.